The city of Venice.
Didn't just appear. It was born from a desperate escape. This city was supposed to be a hiding place, but it became the greatest naval empire in the world. But what happens when the very thing that saved the city starts to destroy it?
Can Venice, the impossible city, survive the impossible future?
The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century AD was not just a political event. It was a true cataclysm that plunged once flourishing lands into chaos and anarchy. The once mighty Roman legions, which had ensured peace and security, vanished, leaving the civilian population defenseless against constant invasions by barbarian tribes. There was no one left to protect the inhabitants from pillaging, destruction, and enslavement. Along the Adriatic coast, in what is now northern Italy, cities that had prospered thanks to Roman infrastructure were being reduced to ruins. The first and most brutal wave of invaders were the Huns, led by Attila, the scourge of God, who in 452 AD savagely plundered Aquileia, Concordia, and other cities. The fear of these barbarians was so great that people abandoned their homes, leaving everything behind. But the real, long-term threat came later. In 568 AD, the Lombards invaded these lands. Unlike the Huns, who merely plundered, the Lombards sought to settle in the conquered territories, which meant a complete loss of identity and freedom for the local inhabitants. Faced with this inevitable fate, the last residents of the Roman cities and settlements decided that the only chance for survival was to flee. They looked to the swampy, infertile, and seemingly uninhabitable lands in the lagoons of the Adriatic Sea. This was not a place to live, but a hiding place. The barbarian cavalry, which so easily crossed the mainland, could not navigate the viscous mud, and their heavy ships could not find their way through the complex, tangled labyrinth of shallow channels. The people who fled to the swamps had only one goal: to survive. It was a desperate decision, as life in the lagoon was incredibly harsh. There was no fresh water and no fertile land for agriculture. The only food was fish and mollusks, and the only source of income was salt, which they learned to extract from the seawater. The first settlements were far from any architectural grandeur. They were simple, fragile huts built on wooden piles driven into the seabed. This primitive but effective method of construction was the first step toward creating an incredible city. The wooden piles provided stability in unstable ground conditions, and the life that emerged on the water became unique. It was from these first, desperate steps that the history of one of the most amazing cities on the planet began. Gradually, the desperate flight turned into a conscious process of adapting to the new environment. The people who found refuge in the lagoon began to form organized communities. The lagoon turned out to be not just a large swamp, but a complex network of over 100 tiny islets separated by channels. Each of these settlements, such as Torcello, Murano, Malamocco, and Rialto, initially existed independently. The inhabitants of these islets chose the highest plots to avoid constant flooding, and their unity and survival depended on their ability to cooperate. Unlike mainland cities that were protected by walls, Venice's safety lay precisely in its isolation and the complexity of its waterways. This isolation became the driving force for economic development. Since there was no fertile land on the islands, agriculture was impossible. Instead, the inhabitants focused on what the sea and the lagoon could give them. Fishing became the main source of food, but the real treasure was salt. By evaporating it from seawater, the Venetians created a valuable commodity that was worth its weight in gold in the Middle Ages. This was the first step toward the development of trade, which allowed them to exchange salt for food and other goods they lacked. Gradually, these trade operations expanded, drawing the Venetians into regional and then international trade. In the beginning, Venice could not exist without outside support. It fell under the protectorate of the Byzantine Empire, which still maintained its influence on the Adriatic. This relationship was mutually beneficial. The Byzantines gained an important trading post on the western border of their empire, and the Venetians gained protection and trade privileges. The Byzantine influence was felt in everything: architecture, art, law, and even the political system. Thanks to Byzantine contacts, the Venetians gained access to Eastern markets, which allowed them to trade in exotic goods such as silk, spices, and fragrances. These goods came from China, India, and Persia, opening up colossal opportunities for the Venetians to get rich. This dependence on Byzantium would eventually decrease, but its cultural legacy, which combined Western and Eastern aesthetics, would forever remain in Venice's architecture and mosaics. This period was a time of shaping the character of the future city-state. Desperate refugees living in harsh natural conditions were transformed into cunning merchants who built their future not on war, but on trade and diplomacy. It was from this network of independent yet interconnected settlements that a single mighty and unique Venice would eventually grow. Building a city on water is one of the most grandiose engineering achievements in human history. It required not only courage, but also a deep knowledge of materials, geology, and hydrodynamics. The foundation for every building was essentially a forest driven into the water. For this, thousands of wooden piles, mostly made of durable oak or larch, were used, as they were extremely resistant to rotting underwater. They were delivered from distant forests at the foot of the Alps and in the territory of modern Croatia and Slovenia. The logistics were incredibly complex. The timber was floated down rivers to the lagoon and then transported by special barges to the construction sites. The most important stage was driving the piles. Hundreds of people worked to drive the piles one by one as tightly as possible. This process took months, or even years. After the piles were driven, thick wooden planks were laid on top of them, forming a single platform. This platform, submerged underwater, did not rot due to the lack of oxygen, and the minerals in the salt water made it stronger, turning the wood into a stone-like substance. The next stage was construction. The main materials, stone and marble, were also transported by sea. Stone was brought from the quarries of Istria, and marble from Greece and Byzantine territories. Each block, weighing tons, was moved by special barges that traveled through the channels and then lifted with primitive lifting mechanisms. On this platform, which supported the weight of an entire city, the first floors and then the luxurious palaces were built. The canals that would later become Venice's trademark were initially just natural waterways. But with the city's development, they were deepened, widened, and straightened. Engineers created complex waterways that allowed people to travel throughout the city, and the bridges that connected the islands were true works of art. At first, they were wooden, but later they were replaced with stone ones, which were more durable and long-lasting. However, even with such engineering skill, Venice constantly battled the problem of flooding, especially during high water, acqua alta. To avoid this, the ground floors of buildings were often not used as living spaces, but as warehouses. The buildings themselves were built on higher foundations, and St. Mark's Square, which was the lowest point of the city, was constantly raised. The Venetians learned that their struggle with water would be constant, and they learned to live in harmony with it. On a foundation of wooden piles, Venice built not just a city, but a true empire. Its flourishing was due to the transformation of a geographical disadvantage into a huge advantage. Since the city had no resources for agriculture, it was forced to rely entirely on trade, turning into the perfect intermediary between the East and the West. Its location at the crossroads of trade routes allowed Venice to become the main supplier of exotic goods: silk, spices, fragrances, jewelry, that came from Asia to Europe via the Mediterranean Sea. This brought enormous wealth to the city, which became the basis of its power. The key to success was the Venetian fleet. The city invested huge sums in shipbuilding, turning it into a true art form. Their fast galleys were unrivaled, combining speed, cargo capacity, and maneuverability. Venice had the largest fleet in the Mediterranean, and its greatness was due to the unique organization of production at the arsenal, the state shipyard. This was the world's first example of mass production. Ships were built on a conveyor belt principle. They were moved from one section to another, where each worker performed a specific operation. This efficiency allowed a ship to be built in a matter of days, not months. This technological advantage enabled Venice to control the Adriatic Sea, which became its internal lake. The wealth that flowed into the city led to an incredible architectural boom. On the site of old wooden huts, luxurious marble palaces began to rise, adorned with arches and colonnades. The Venetian style, which combined Byzantine luxury, Eastern elements, and Western Gothic, was unique. The culmination of this flourishing was such masterpieces as the Doge's Palace, which symbolized the power of the government, and St. Mark's Basilica, which was decorated with golden mosaics that told the city's history. All these buildings faced the water, as the canals were the city's main streets, emphasizing its dependence on the sea. The water that was the basis of Venice's existence also became its main protector. The shallow waters of the lagoon, with its complex currents and changing seabed, were an insurmountable barrier for any enemy fleet that did not have detailed knowledge of the area. Land armies were powerless, as they could not reach the city. The water protected Venice no less than walls, allowing it to focus on trade and diplomacy without spending resources on direct defense. This gave rise to a unique form of government, a republic ruled by a trading elite that built its empire not with the sword, but with gold and naval power. Venetian engineers and architects were true geniuses of their time. They didn't just build on water, they developed unique technologies that allowed the city to survive for over 1,000 years. The biggest secret was in the foundations. Piles made of oak and larch were driven into the seabed very tightly, and on top of them, wooden platforms were laid, on which stone buildings were then built. The main trick was that the wood, submerged in clay and mud, did not rot due to the lack of oxygen. On the contrary, the salt water, which constantly circulated, saturated the wood with minerals, turning it into a hard stone-like substance. Thanks to this, the foundations laid centuries ago still support the weight of multi-story palaces. The Venetians also developed a unique canal system that was not just a transport network, but a complex engineering system. They understood that constant water movement was important for its purification and to prevent silting. The canals were designed in such a way that sea tides and ebbs created a natural circulation that would wash away dirt. They also built special dams and locks to control the water level in the lagoon. The technologies developed by the Venetians are impressive in their longevity. For example, many of the canals that were dug in the Middle Ages are still in use today. While modern cities struggle with problems of silting and pollution, Venetian engineers solved these problems centuries ago. In addition, Venetian architects learned to avoid destruction during severe storms. They built houses on high foundations, and the main squares were raised to minimize the impact of water. They also built walls and bridges from durable material that could withstand the force of the tides. Every element of the city was designed with the understanding that it would constantly interact with water. Even today, modern engineers study Venetian technologies to understand how the city could have survived for so long in such difficult conditions. The secrets of the Venetian masters, hidden underwater, are evidence that humans can turn natural obstacles into opportunities if they have enough knowledge, skill, and patience. At its peak, Venice became a true maritime empire that controlled vast territories and trade routes throughout the Mediterranean. It was not an empire that conquered lands with an army, like Rome, but an empire that built its wealth on trade and diplomacy. Its influence extended from the Adriatic to the Black Sea. Venice had trading posts, bases, and colonies in the territory of modern Greece, Cyprus, and Crimea, which allowed it to control trade with the Ottoman Empire, India, and China. The key factor in Venice's success was its dominance in shipbuilding. The local shipyards, known as the Arsenal, were a true marvel of engineering. Here, through mass production, ships were built with incredible speed. The ships moved through different sections where they were equipped with masts, sails, and weapons. This system, which resembled a modern conveyor belt, allowed for the rapid replacement of losses in the fleet and maintaining its superiority. Engineering innovations such as galleons with high sides and advanced rigging gave Venice an advantage over its competitors. Venetian merchants were among the richest in the world. They controlled the trade in silk, spices, glass, fur, and other luxury goods. Venice was the center of world trade, where goods from all over the known world flowed. Banking and finance also flourished, making Venice one of the first international financial centers. Venice's success was based on its ability to maintain peaceful relations with most of its trading partners. It rarely entered into open wars, preferring diplomatic agreements and commercial alliances. Its fleet protected trade routes, but was rarely used for conquest. This allowed Venice to focus on increasing its wealth and cultural development. This period, known as the Golden Age of Venice, was the peak of its power and influence, turning the city into a true queen of the Adriatic. Despite all its splendor, life in Venice also had a dark side. It was a constant struggle with hostile nature and human threats. One of the biggest problems was diseases and epidemics. Thanks to intensive trade and a constant influx of foreigners, Venice became an ideal place for the spread of plague and other infections. The most terrible epidemic in the 14th century took almost half of the city's population. In response, the Venetians established the world's first quarantine island, the Lazaretto, where they isolated ships and passengers to prevent the spread of diseases. Another constant threat was flooding. Despite all the engineering efforts, the city was regularly flooded during high water, acqua alta. People had to move around on special wooden platforms, and the ground floors of houses often became uninhabitable. The water that had saved the city from the barbarians was now threatening its existence. Fires were also a constant threat, as most buildings were wooden, and the narrow streets and canals made it difficult to extinguish them. In the political arena, Venice had many enemies. The main competitor in the Mediterranean was Genoa, another powerful maritime republic. For many years, they waged brutal wars for control of trade routes. Genoese fleets repeatedly tried to blockade Venice, and only thanks to its arsenal and military cunning did the Venetians manage to maintain their advantage. Over time, the very water that made the city impregnable began to become a problem. The canals were silting up, and the constant struggle with water required colossal financial and human resources. Climate change and rising sea levels, which were not yet known, only worsened the situation. The Golden Age of Venice began to slowly fade as internal problems and external threats became more and more serious. Venice is a city with two worlds, one visible on the surface, with its canals, palaces, and bridges, and another, hidden underwater, which holds millennia-old secrets. Modern research and divers are uncovering these hidden underwater artifacts, which allow for a better understanding of the city's early history. For example, remnants of old palaces that sank during rising sea levels have been found underwater, as well as hidden tunnels and underground warehouses that were used for smuggling or storing goods. Venice was a city labyrinth, where secret passages and hidden places existed. Although most of the legends about underwater tunnels connecting different islands remain myths, divers have found remnants of old wells and drainage systems that testify to the complex engineering network that existed under the city. These findings help scientists understand how the Venetians fought with water, how they built their foundations, and how they built sewage systems. The underwater artifacts found in the lagoon are an important source of information about the city's early history. Remnants of ancient ships, ceramic products, weapons, and even treasures have been found here. These findings indicate that the lagoon was a lively center of trade and life. Each artifact pulled from the mud tells its own story, about a ship that sank during a storm, about a merchant who lost his goods, or about a warrior who defended the city. The secrets hidden underwater are a testament to Venice's constant struggle with nature. The water was not only their protector, but also a place where they hid their secrets. These underwater remains, preserved thanks to the special conditions of the lagoon, provide a unique opportunity to look into the past and understand how this amazing city arose and developed. The greatness of Venice, like any empire, was not eternal. The end of its power came not through military defeat, but through a change in world trade routes. The discovery of America by Christopher Columbus in 1492 and the sea route to India around Africa by the Portuguese fundamentally changed the geopolitical landscape. European states such as Portugal, Spain, and England began to build their colonial empires. The center of world trade shifted from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic Ocean. Venice, which had built its wealth on trade with the East, was no longer the main intermediary. Its fleet, although perfect, could not compete with the new, more powerful ships adapted for ocean voyages. The city's economy began to decline. The constant wars with the Ottoman Empire for control of territories in the Mediterranean also exhausted Venice, which no longer had its former financial power. In addition, the water that was once an ally began to become an enemy again. Climate change led to frequent floods, and the silting of the canals complicated navigation. Venice, which was a model of technology and engineering, could not find an effective way to deal with these problems. It lost its commercial flair and innovative spirit. The final blow to Venice was delivered by Napoleon Bonaparte, who captured the city in 1797. The Venetian Republic, which had existed for over 1,000 years, was destroyed without a single shot. The city lost its independence and was annexed to the Austrian Empire. The fall of Venice became a symbol of the end of the era of maritime republics. Today, Venice is again fighting for its existence, and again its main enemy is water. Climate change and rising sea levels threaten the city that was its ally for centuries. Floods, which were once a rare phenomenon, now occur much more frequently, causing serious damage to historical monuments and buildings. To save the city, a large-scale engineering project called MOSE, Modulo Sperimentale Elettromeccanico, was developed. It is a system of huge mobile barriers located at the entrance to the lagoon. During tides, these barriers rise to protect Venice from flooding. The project was very complex, expensive, and controversial, but it gives the city a chance to survive. However, even with the MOSE project, Venice's future remains uncertain. Climate change, as well as the huge influx of tourists that damages its infrastructure, creates new challenges. Today, the city is forced to find a balance between preserving its historical heritage and adapting to modern realities. This is a struggle for survival, and its outcome is unpredictable. Can the city on water survive the 21st century? The answer depends on how effective modern technologies will be and how ready humanity will be to solve the problems of climate change. Venice, which was once a symbol of naval power, is now a symbol of our world's fragility in the face of natural forces.